Welcome back to the Nerdy Grill and welcome back to the 12th video in this ranking every episode from every Doctor's series. In the last episode we had a look at the third Doctor played by the amazing Jon Pertwee, finishing off the 1970s era of the show, and now we're going to be teetering back into the black and white era of the show in the 1960s, in particular the late 1960s, and have a little look at the amazing era from the second Doctor played by Patrick Troughton, who was a rather clownish, quirky Doctor who had a lot of base Under Siege style stories and took on the Cybermen a fair few times, which I love the Cybermen, and also my favourite villains of the Ice Warriors, as you can see behind with my Steelbooks and Ice Warrior vinyl record. Now, how does this work? Well, I do this in a tier list format. We did start the series with the 15th Doctor, played by Ncuti Gatwa, and worked our way down to where we are now with Patrick Troughton. And obviously, next week will be the last video in this series where I will look at the first Doctor, played by William Hartnell. Just keep in mind with all these lists, this is just my personal opinion based on my own personal enjoyment of the stories. Now, the Patrick Troughton era, unlike other eras, for the majority of it was lost. But luckily, over the last decade or so, we have had a fair few of his lost stories reconstructed through various means, in the most part through animations, which have had a variety of different qualities to them. But overall, it's just been nice to see these missing stories come to light. There are still one or two stories still missing from the Patrick Troughton era that have yet to be animated in any way, shape or form, but we will discuss those when I get into the tier list. So without any further ado, let's jump straight in to my ranking of every single second Doctor story. Okay, and this is my tier list ranking every single second Doctor episode. Now, from the get-go, you can probably notice that this is a little bit different to how it usually is. There's a couple of things I just want to explain. Okay, so the William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton era are still kind of incomplete. There's still a couple of stories from each era that are still lost and they haven't been either found, reconstructed, or animated yet, and so I can't exactly rank them on the list. So there's two stories on this particular tier list that are going to go into a category which I'm going to call Lost Story. So this normally would be like bottom of the barrel terrible, but these are just going to be for stories that I actually haven't watched because they are still technically lost stories. There's luckily only two stories on this list where that's the case. All the rest I can talk about. So instead, there's only 4 categories for the Patrick Troughton, and there'll only be 4 categories for the William Hartnell era. So top of the shop, we've got Our Lives Are Different to Anybody Else's. That's the exciting thing. There's nobody in the universe can do what we're doing. Then in good, we've got There Are Some Corners of the Universe which have bred the most terrible things. Things that act against everything that we believe in. They must be fought. Then in the okay category, we've got Logic, My Dear Zoe, merely enables one to be wrong with authority. And then we've got just the bad and terrible in one category here this time round, which is You've had this place redecorated, haven't you? I don't like it. And then obviously we've got Lost Story. But you also might notice on this list is we've got both the War Games and the new War Games in colour. Because I thought that they cut out enough of the story, changed the music, tried to change a bit of the characters to a degree, and they add in the regeneration at the end. I thought there's enough of a change for me to think that I can actually rank them differently, the original to the coloured version. So I've decided to add the War Games in colour onto this list as well. So without any further ado, let's jump straight into this Patrick Troughton list, starting with The Power of the Daleks, which for me, The Power of the Daleks is actually quite a fun Doctor Who story, and I'm going to put it up here in the equivalent of what A tier would be, so the second category. I quite like Power of the Daleks. It's the first post-regeneration story, so we've just lost William Hartnell, we've got Ben and Polly who are still stuck around, they're unsure about what's going on. You've got a Doctor for half of this story that doesn't truly know if he's the Doctor or not. He flutters in and out thinking, am I the Doctor, am I not the Doctor? You know, he knows some things not quite right. He's trying to put himself back together. And so they give us the Daleks, you know, something from the Hartnell era, so that us as fans have something to latch on to, because Ben and Polly were still fairly new companions at the time. I quite like what they do in Power of the Daleks, where the Daleks are sort of subtly trying to imply that they are good people. They're not out to hurt anybody, but secretly they're plotting revenge, and they're subtly reconstructing themselves and building up an army. I think it's quite fun, and you can see the quirky nature of Patrick Troughton from the get-go in this story as well. You can see the differences between him and Hartnell, and I think Ben and Polly, you know, Ben and Polly have never really been my favourite in terms of companions. They've always felt like they've not really done enough, but they're pretty alright. And, you know, obviously the questioning of the Doctor, you know, is warranted in this story as well. And Ben's a lot more questionable of the Doctor than Polly is. But, you know, that's just how fans would have been at the time. But yeah, the Daleks are still on top form, and I quite like Power of the Daleks. The Highlanders. So this one is going into the Lost Story. So just because Highlanders is at the bottom, do not think that is because it is a terrible story. That is not the terrible story category. That is just Lost Story. Unfortunately, I have actually not got round to being able to... I know there's like an audio variant of it that you can listen to. I've unfortunately not got round to listening to it. And obviously, visually, it's no longer with us. So I can't really talk about it. But all I can say, this is the story that introduces the fan favourite companion, the key one of the Troughton era, Jamie McCrimmon, who adds to the dynamic then of Ben and Polly as well. But Jamie doesn't really do an awful lot to start with in a lot of the earlier stories of Jamie. But yeah, so it is a shame. So hopefully this story will get animated at some point in the future, or found, who knows. But yeah, so unfortunately that one is a lost story. Then we've got The Underwater Menace. That one is going immediately into bad and terrible. So we had two different releases of The Underwater Menace. We had a variant where it was, I think it's parts 2 and 3, I think, are the ones that exist. And then parts 1 and 4 were just reconstructed. They just threw out a reconstruction on a DVD. They didn't even bother trying to animate those parts. So it was awful to try and watch. And then we did... only like a year or two ago, I think it might be 2 years ago now, we actually got a full-blown animation of The Underwater Menace. So we could watch the whole story in animation, so it was all complete. But overall, the story is just a bit of a slogfest, and it's a bit dull. You've got this mad professor guy who's really hamming it up, you know, so you've got a bit of entertainment there with him. But overall, there's not a lot to hang on to. The companions don't really do a lot. I'm not a huge fan of the redesign of the water creatures. They look a lot better in the original variant than the animated variant. The animation also is a little bit iffy, if I'm being honest. It looks okay, but not brilliant. Again, I think the TARDIS team was too big. You know, Troughton was also still trying to find himself. Yeah, you got another Atlantis-based story, and it's all right, but I'm just not a huge fan of Underwater Menace. It's not the best. You know, it's one that I personally think you could probably skip over. The Moon Base, I'm putting that one up here. I'm a massive... You know me, I love the Cybermen. They are my second favourite Doctor Who villain of all time. I'm not just being biased because of the Cybermen. I generally like the Moon Base. You know, a proper base under siege story. What you'll find with early Troughton as well is like either Ben, Polly or Jamie will get left out. And in this story, Jamie's the one that gets left out. He hurts himself at the start of the story, and he's sort of left in a medical room. He's like hallucinating. He accuses the Cybermen of being like the weird Pied Piper who comes to abduct people, you know. It's really weird. But yeah, the Cybermen are trying to invade the moon base. They are taking out the crew one by one, and they are doing it through the sugar in the coffee and teas that the crew drink. The Doctor figures that out because obviously only some crew get infected and have to go to the medical bay for the Cybermen to then take them and convert them into Cybermen or turn them into zombies, but some don't get ill from it, and that's because some people will take sugar, some people won't. So it's a nice little way to do it, and it's creative for the Cybermen. Also, the new Cyberman design, even though I'm more of a fan of the Mondasian variant design, still look really good. I will admit their voices are really, really good and creepy here. They've got a bit of that like techno-electronic voice to it as well. You know, it's very robotic, but yet you can still see enough humanity in them. I quite like the design you get in Moonbase and in Tomb of the Cybermen as well. So it was done really, really well and nicely. And I think the claustrophobic feel of the Moonbase, the Cybermen taking up the corridors, taking people, you know, in the night when they're least expecting it, I think is done really, really well. And the Doctor's got a lot of stuff to do, and he's got some great speeches, especially the one which is right here. You know, there are some corners of the universe which have bred the most terrible things. I think that is a brilliant little speech. and a brilliant way of like warning people about the dangers. You know, the universe is great, but it's also home to some terrible things that we need to stand up against and can't let that evil take over, obviously referring to the Cybermen as well. But yeah, definitely recommend watching the Moonbase. This story is also partly animated as well. Some of the parts don't exist, but the animation is done really, really well and nicely in this story. Then you've got the Macra Terror. Now, the Macra Terror for me is okay. It's nothing like spectacular. I think these Macra are definitely better than the Macra that we get when we cross over into the new series with Gridlock. They're just like a savage form of Macra, which the Doctor, I think, does explain in Gridlock about it. Whereas these are a lot more highly intelligent, you know. And the companions, again, they feel a bit lost and all over the place. You know, Ben and Polly, you know, think about Ben and Polly at this point. You know, they've been around for a while now. You know, they had 3 adventures with William Hartnell, and now they've had 5 adventures with Patrick Troughton. You know, they've had like 8 stories, and they still feel a bit lost. Not doing an awful lot. They don't really write them in the best way, if I'm being perfectly honest. And even though the Macra look great, especially in animation and are creepy, I don't know. Again, it just feels like one of those stories where just not an awful lot seems to stick with me. I'm not huge on the Macra Terror. I like the design of the Macra, and I think they're a great creation. Glad they came back in New Who. I would love to see them again, but I just don't know if they were really done amazingly, if you get what I mean. The Faceless Ones. Unfortunately, I'm putting the Faceless Ones down here. I recently rewatched this a couple of months ago with my fiance. We watched the full animation, and I just remember it being a slog. This is the final story for Ben and Polly. So they leave at the end of this story, so leaving us just with the Doctor and Jamie. And it all takes place in an airport where there's mysterious flights and things are going wrong. People are vanishing, you know. There's this Chameleon Tours airline that's going on that's taking people. You know, people are getting... going on holiday, vanishing, never coming back, and just sending like the remaining loved ones like a little postcard, and that's about all they get. And so you get to see different families and different people who go to the airport and say, "Excuse me, where's so and so? Why are they not here? You know, I got this. What's happening?" You know, I like all that, and they take Polly away for this story. So Polly is kidnapped by the Chameleon Tours and has like a memory wiped and is replaced, and which is not really great for your final story of a companion. You want to spend that story getting to know that companion in particular. So the fact that Polly is out of action for most of this story and you're mostly just left with the Doctor and Jamie is not the best. It is just a bit slow paced. I don't think it needed to be a 6-parter either. There's definitely a couple of times where it felt like they could have wrapped up the story a lot sooner than they did. And like I said, you've got your companions of Ben and Polly who are leaving at the end of the story. Do something with them. Don't introduce this new character halfway through the story who seems to have like a fascination with her and Jamie. She's almost like a Victoria, which is quite funny because then Victoria comes into it in the next story. You know, almost, yeah, like a Diet Victoria. And they focus on her being like a little mini companion. You know, she's trying to find someone who's gone missing through the Chameleon Tours as well, which is nice to do that. But when you've got 2 other companions that need stuff to do, I don't think they should have done that. There's some really weird Easter eggs in the animation as well. Like they add pictures of Roger Delgado and Sacha Dhawan's master in the background in this as well. So it really takes the immersion away. The animation's pretty good, I will admit. But as a story, it bores me a bit. Then we've got Evil of the Daleks, which for me, I love Evil of the Daleks just as much as I do Power of the Daleks. I think both the Patrick Troughton Dalek stories are really good and really entertaining. Did it need to be a 7-parter? I don't think so. I think you could have cut this story down a little bit. It didn't need to be 7 parts. I think the stuff on Skaro and all at the end with the Emperor Dalek and all is really good. I think the human element Daleks, you know, like Alpha, Omega, and Beta, I think that's what they're called. They are hilarious. Patrick Troughton riding around on a Dalek, I think, is hilarious. I think the combination of Jamie and the Doctor works really well. This introduces Victoria, who obviously, you know, has been kidnapped by the Daleks, being held hostage. Her father is trying to save her, but he's also having to work with the Daleks. You know, there's so much going on in this story. And this was supposed to be the final end for the Daleks, which is why it's such a massive climax at the end, where all the Daleks are like turning on each other and are killing each other, and the Emperor's exploding, and it was supposed to be, this is it for the Daleks, and we weren't going to see them again. And we generally after this didn't for a fair few years. There was a good 3-4 years with no Dalek story. Then they returned obviously in Day of the Daleks, but if this was the last story for the Daleks, I think it would have been a decent one to end on. But I just think it did drag a little bit, to be honest. Only part 2 of this story exists, so all the rest is animated. They even animated that part as well. But yeah, 6 out of the 7 parts are missing. It would be nice to one day get to see Evil of the Daleks in its proper glory. But yeah, definitely a good Dalek story. I would recommend watching Evil of the Daleks, and I'm really glad we did eventually get it. Tomb of the Cybermen. Yay, we finally got a Patrick Troughton that is immediately going up into S tier. Some people may say this is overrated. I don't know. Yes, I said before, the Cybermen are my second favourite Doctor Who villains of all time, and that there's no bias. I can't deny, this was my very first Patrick Troughton story. Tomb of the Cybermen was amazing. It's a short 4-parter of the Doctor, Jamie and Victoria, tagging along with this expedition of people who are going to Telos to find the tombs of the Cybermen, to hopefully see some of the remains of the Cybermen and see if any Cybermen still exist. And they got a nice cast of characters where you like them all in one way, shape or form. Even the villains, because you think they're really interesting characters. Like Klieg, oh my god, he's great. Toberman, I love Toberman, he's really, really good. I just love all the characters. They make you like every character in this story, and you really feel for a lot of the characters. There's some great speeches, especially when the Doctor is trying to comfort Victoria, who's remembering the loss of her father from Evil of the Daleks, and she's talking about how the Doctor's really old. Because the Doctor reveals his age. I think he says 450 at this point. And she goes on about how he's so old he probably can't remember a family. So I don't know why I'm telling you this. And the Doctor gives a lovely speech that he does when he chooses to, And when he closes his eyes, they come back into his mind, I quite like all that. And I think it's really good. And shows you how this clownish Doctor can also be quite serious and wise, and really comfort those in need. The tombs look amazing. The Cybermen still have that moon-based design with a little bit of a tweak to them. The voices sound great. I love the Cyber Controller. The little, helmet dome that the Cyber Controller does look a little bit odd, I'm not going to lie, but I think overall it's great. The introduction and use of the Cybermats, I think, is really good in this as well. Adds a new little twist to the Cybermen, and it's a very well-paced story. And yeah, I quite like it, and I highly, highly recommend watching Tomb of the Cybermen. You will have a great time with Tomb of the Cybermen. Even if you're not a Doctor Who fan, I think if you're a sci-fi fan, put on Tomb of the Cybermen, you'll love it. The Abominable Snowmen. I feel like this one is also just okay. It's got that sort of vibe of Macra Terror for me personally. The Yetis are an interesting creature, doing the Abominable Snowmen, takes place in the Himalayas. I love the snowscapes and everything that they got going on. The setting, the Tibetan setting, with all the monks and everything. I think that's done really nice. The Great Intelligence is a good little creature to introduce, this highly intelligent being that can possess and control people and objects and this, that and the other. I think that's all really nice. I just think it's very slow paced, although this does have a really funny line in it as well, where towards the end of the story, Jamie comes up with an idea to try and solve and save everything, and the Doctor and Victoria holding each other. The Doctor's like, yeah, come on, Victoria, and Victoria's like, what's going on? Where are we going? It's like, Jamie has an idea. Let's get out of here. I love all that. I love the relationship that the Doctor, Jamie and Victoria have with each other. It's really nice. But yeah, it's an okay story, don't get me wrong. And I like the design of the Yetis. I like them in particular a bit more in this story than in a future story. But I do prefer the future story out of the two. So I'll explain when we get to that story. The Ice Warriors. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I love the Ice Warriors. But I can't deny, their first story is only okay. I know, the Ice Warriors, my favourite Doctor Who villain of all time, and I'm only putting their one of 2 stories they have in the Troughton era in only okay. Yeah, the first Ice Warrior story is alright. You've got these creatures that are stuck in the ice, their spaceship is caught in the ice, and you've got this expedition of people who are going out, they're chopping down the ice, they're discovering these things, and the Ice Warriors reawaken. It's all quite nice, but it's, again, very slow-paced. And that's the problem with a lot of the Troughton and Hartnell eras. They make them 6 to 7 parts. But they don't realise that there's not enough content to fill those parts. So there's a lot of just the same old, same old. Love the design of the Ice Warriors. I love their hissing is great. You know, I think it is done really, really well. I like the Ice Warriors, don't get me wrong, but their first story, I can't deny, is not the best, if I'm perfectly honest. Enemy of the World. This story is a good story. I love Enemy of the World. This is one of my fiance's favourites. You know, and you know me as well. I love a good doppelganger story, and Enemy of the World is that to a T. It is debatably one of the best doppelganger stories in Doctor Who. You've got the second Doctor, Jamie and Victoria, who land, and they end up immediately they're there to have a little bit of a vacation, and they immediately get swarmed by these people who see the second Doctor and accuse him of being this world dictator who looks exactly like him, known as Salamander. And you've got Salamander, who's this horrible, violent dictator who's managing to take over the world. You know, he's controlling different areas, wants to become, you know, ruler of all, and he's pretty much there. And he's also looks exactly like the second Doctor, and he's also got this civilization that he's hiding away. He's keeping these people locked away and pretending that the world up there is actually, you know, deadly and dangerous, and he's like keeping them all locked away in the dark, and he's pretending to be the savior. I love stuff like that. I think that's really good. So you got that little subplot going on. You've got the Doctor who, because he looks like Salamander, he agrees to help save the world, you know, by, you know, taking down Salamander's organization from the inside. Because he looks like Salamander, he can obviously then pretend to be Salamander, and that's pretty much what he does. I like the confrontation between the Doctor and Salamander at the end, where Salamander actually makes his way into the TARDIS, tricking Jamie and Victoria into thinking he's the Doctor, and then goes into the TARDIS. The Doctor obviously comes back, and they sort of have a tussle, and then Salamander gets tossed into the time vortex, never to be seen again. I would love to see Salamander return on screen in one way, shape or form. Maybe because of his exposure to the TARDIS and the time vortex, he could come back looking like whatever the current incarnation of the Doctor is, and I think that could have been a really interesting idea. But yeah, Enemy of the World, really good story. And this one actually was a lost story that they found everything for, so you can watch all 6 episodes in their entirety. Whereas Ice Warriors, I should have mentioned, does have 2 episodes missing. Web of Fear. I do prefer Web of Fear a little bit more than I prefer The Abominable Snowmen, which is why this one is higher on the list than The Abominable Snowmen. Web of Fear is the first story to introduce Nicholas Courtney as Brigadier Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart. But he's not the Brigadier in this story. He's Colonel Lethbridge Stewart. You know, he's not the Brigadier yet. That comes next, in the next story. But it is the first time that we see the Brigadier, which is really, really nice. Nicholas Courtney's great in this. Unfortunately, the part that he first comes in part 3, is the only part of the story that doesn't exist. And this particular version of Web of Fear has this really awkward 3D animation, which not a huge fan of, if I'm perfectly honest, but the story itself is great. All takes place in the London Underground, with the Great Intelligence has returned, the Yetis are back, trying to take over the London Underground, and in the end they want to try and possess and take over the Doctor, which I think is really, really cool. Really claustrophobic, really scary feel. I love the sounds the Yetis make. I love this slight redesign they got in this as well. They start off as the big bushy versions that you get from Abominable Snowmen, but then when they're possessed by the Great Intelligence and on the attack, that all like comes away, and you got these glowing eyes, these mouths, their claws come out. They're like grizzly bears, and it is really scary to see them waddling through the London Underground. I quite like it, to be honest. But yeah, really good story. Definitely recommend it. The Fury from the Deep. Now this might upset some people, because I know some people do like Fury from the Deep. I'm not a huge fan of Fury from the Deep, and that's why it's going down here towards the bottom of my list for Patrick Troughton. It is Victoria's last story, and I do think that Victoria and Jamie's little discussion that they have towards the end is very sweet, very touching. I love that Jamie has obviously built this proper bond with Victoria. He sees her as like a sister, but also a best friend. I think he also developed a little bit of feelings for her in almost a romantic sense as well. But they had a really nice bond together, so it was very sweet. And the Doctor trying to comfort Jamie as well was nice. Victoria gets a nice family to stay with again, you know, obviously after losing her father and all in Evil of the Daleks, which is nice. I like this. This is the first story that features the sonic screwdriver, which is like this tiny little silver thing with a light on top. Which is nice, you know, a bit of Doctor Who history there for you as well. But yeah, the seaweed creatures, I don't know, just the animation seems alright, but there's times where it just seems very plain and basic. Another base Under Siege story. Yeah, the Doctor Who has fallen into this pattern at this point where they just seem to be rinsing and repeating things and just changing the monster to suit whatever type of story they want to tell. But yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of Fury from the Deep. It's okay. Then we've got The Wheel in Space. Now, technically, this is a lost story because 3 parts don't exist. But 3 parts you can technically watch in one way, shape or form. Part 1 you can watch through a weird animation. And then I think it's parts 3 and... It's either 3 and 6 or 4 and 6 you can watch normally. So I'm actually going to rate this one because I have actually watched this one a couple of times and I've seen enough of it to give my thoughts on it. If I'm perfectly honest... The Wheel in Space, I'm going to say is just okay. Because I feel it's a little bit unfair to put it in terrible when obviously still half of it is not around. I feel like it, if you get what I mean. So it could go in terrible, but I feel like it's unfair to put it that low because there's still 3 parts that I can't really talk about. But this story, you know, does have the Cybermen again, which I do love the Cybermen. It is the weakest Cyberman story of the Troughton era. The Cybermen design is okay, but it's not the best. It's like a weird combination of the Moonbase Tomb ones and then the later Invasion ones. Sort of like trying to do a weird transition, but doesn't really work very well. The sounds of the Cybermen are also really odd. They sound like they're really nasally and have like they got a bunged up nose. They can't really talk properly. They're like, you will be... And it's like, I'm not a huge fan of that. This was also originally apparently penned to be a Dalek and a Cyberman story combined, which I did hear rumours and all about that. And I think if that original script had come out and they used that, that would have been really, really good and entertaining for this story. But yeah, instead you've just got the Cybermen are basically doing what they did in the Moonbase. They're just trying to invade the wheel, take over the wheel so they can control the world. You know, it's literally the same thing as the Moonbase, more or less, but just done not as good. This also introduces us to the companion of Zoe Herriot, played by Wendy Padbury, who I recently met again, and she signed my War Games in Colour Steelbook. Which Zoe, I love Zoe. She's my... I love the companionship of the Dr. Jamie and Zoe a bit more than the Dr. Jamie and Victoria or the Dr. Jamie, Ben and Polly. The Dr. Jamie and Zoe are my favourite second Dr. TARDIS team, which is really, really nice. You know, I quite like that. And also Jamie comes up with the name or little nickname that the Doctor uses all throughout Doctor Who from now on when he wants to disguise himself as a person or a human. John Smith, which I thought was really, really neat as well. But yeah, it's okay. But again... You could debate whether it goes in terrible, but I feel a bit gutted to do that when still half of it doesn't exist. Then you've got the Dominators. The Dominators I'm going to put as okay. I did recently rewatch the Dominators, and I quite enjoyed it. It's a really weird 5-part story. The Quarks are really cute. Apparently the Quarks... It was either the Quarks or the Crotons. I can't remember which. But I remember there was talk about how one of them were going to become like the new Daleks. I want to say it's the Quarks, but I'm unsure. But the Quarks are done really, really well. They're really cute. And the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe land on this planet, which these 2 Dominator characters have come to take over, and they're looking for like highly intelligent beings. The Doctor and Jamie get kidnapped by the Dominators and have to pretend to be stupid because the Dominators are just trying to rule all the galaxy, you know? Yeah, and it is a surprisingly political story as well. Like I said, it's an alright story, but it's just nothing spectacular. Then you've got The Mind Robber. The Mind Robber is going up here, so we finally have another Patrick Troughton story, which is on top of the shop. The Mind Robber is, you know, one of my favourite Doctor Who stories. I love The Mind Robber. If I was to do like a Patrick Troughton top 5, you know, The Mind Robber would easily be in that as well, which this is technically like a top 5 for Patrick Troughton, but The Mind Robber is sort of... It is there and it is absolutely fantastic. You know, the Dr. Jamie and Zoe get transported into the land of fiction where they got creatures like Medusa and a unicorn and a Minotaur and Rapunzel and Blackbeard the pirate. Things from like comic books books and storybooks all coming to life, and they have to try and figure out what the hell is going on. The Jamie's actor gets ill at one point in the story, and because they're in a land of fiction, they incorporate into the plot where Jamie gets like supposedly killed, but he doesn't, and so the Doctor tries to rebuild his face but gets it wrong, so they can swap him with another actor for an episode. And I thought that was really really unique and cool. Your Doctor tackles this creature known as the Master, who is this human who has been taken by this evil intelligence and is using his imagination to build all these creations and bring them to life. It's done in a really good way, and the fast pace of the episodes is there. And the first part of the episode is literally about an 18-minute episode, and literally is just the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe on a white backdrop with some really weird monsters, which I believe were also taken from another show, because they didn't have much budget or things to do. And they managed to make that entertaining, and I think it's done really, really well. Watch The Mind Robber. It's a fantastic story. The Invasion. I do really like The Invasion. Originally, I would have put The Invasion up alongside Tomb of the Cybermen and Mind Robber, but upon certain rewatches, I'm not as keen on The Invasion as I used to. I still think it's a good story, but I think it suffers from being too long. It's an 8-part story, but the Cybermen properly, like visually, don't come on screen until the end of part 4. You do get a cyber planner stroke controller where they use the original Cyberman voices, but for the Cybermen themselves, they do use a new voice, and it does sound a bit weird. But it does have iconic scenes of like the Cybermen invading London, walking down St. Paul in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. You know, really good scenes. The return of Unit, where Nicholas Courtney's now the Brigadier. You know, you've got all the current crew of the makeshift Unit crew, so that's done really well. You know, I like, you know, the core villain as well. I think is really, really good. He's insane. You know, I just think it suffers from being too long. I would love to see an Invasion in colour variant, so they could maybe lower it so then the Cybermen are in the story more, or feel like the Cybermen are in the story more. But the problem with that is one of the missing parts, because there's 2 missing episodes, parts 1 and 4. It'd be a bit hard to do that unless you could find part 1. And this story does follow on from the events of the Mind Robber as well, because the TARDIS is destroyed in the Mind Robber and then gets brought back together at the end of the Mind Robber, and the Invasion starts with the TARDIS being brought back together again. Then you've got the Crotons. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the Crotons. And like I said, was it the Quarks or the Crotons who were meant to be the new Dalek replacements? Not really too sure. But yeah, the Crotons is not a good story. It's not a good story, if I'm being perfectly honest. It's a 4-part story, but yet it's a bit of a slog fest. The amount of times they say Crotons in that as well. And fairly certain there's videos you can watch on YouTube of, you know, how many times they say Crotons. The Crotons, they're just these big, tanky creatures with like a claw arm and all on their front. They can barely move. They got big booming voices. All they want is just to find the most intelligent people to help them with their plot. And so they do that by testing the people around them. The people who score highly on this test get to go into the Croton ship, and they'll never get seen again, because once they go into the Croton ship, the Crotons test them with their equipment. They find out that they're not intelligent enough to work it, and so they send them out the back, get them killed, and then they're never seen again. You know, it's rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. You know, it's just a little bit dull and boring, if I'm honest. I'm not a huge fan of the Crotons, and I know it's not seen as quite a popular one either. The Seeds of Death. This is more of a personal one for me, but the Seeds of Death is also going up top of the shop. So we've got another story, which is, in my opinion, S tier for Patrick Troughton. And yes, it is an Ice Warrior story. You could say biased because I love the Ice Warriors, but it is a fantastic story. The Seeds of Death is a great story. 6 parts, never drags for me. The Ice Warriors using these little seed pods. Again, it's a mixture of a base under siege story and an invasion of Earth story. So I combine the moon base and the invasion, so elements of both, or the wheel in space and the invasion. You know, they're using this TMAP system up on a space station to send these seed pods down to Earth, which will then explode and send out this gas, which wipe out humanity for the Ice Warriors to come down and take over. That's pretty much what they're doing. And obviously the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe have to try and stop them. But it is done really, really well. I love the Doctor running around away from the Ice Warriors. I think it's done really, really well. Definitely recommend watching Seeds of Death. Up there for me as one of the best Patrick Troughtons. Space Pirates is immediately going down here into Lost Story. Unlike the Highlanders, though, there is one part that does exist, which you can watch on the Lost in Time box set. But I haven't actually watched it, and I didn't see the point. And also the other 5 parts don't exist. So the same as the Highlanders, maybe one day we'll get something where we can actually watch it properly or watch an animation, but who knows? So unfortunately, I cannot place the Space Pirates up on the list, so it's now into the Lost Story category. And then finally, we've got the War Games and the War Games in colour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'm going to put the War Games up here and the War Games in colour here. That's what I'm going to do. Yes, I do prefer the original War Games over the War Games in colour. Now look, the War Games in colour does... The only thing for me that the War Games in colour does right, apart from obviously visually looking nice to see the colour, is obviously it shortens a story that didn't need to be 10 parts. I will admit the War Games doesn't need to be 10 parts, and 10 parts is way too long. You can easily cut some content there. I think the War Games maybe should have just been a 6-part story, if I'm honest, and that would have been fine. It didn't need to be 10. But the War Games in colour, like I said, apart from visually looking nice and being shorter, it does make some odd changes to potential lore things, like, you know, making the the War Chief, making him I can't remember if it's the War Chief or the Warlord now. I can't remember which one now it is, but he makes that character potentially the Master, and I'm not a big fan of that. And I know my fiance's not a big fan of that. You know, also playing the Master soundtrack, there's times where the soundtrack really drowns out what the characters are saying. There's characters in this which were in the original version that I really liked, whose scenes get pretty much fully cut. And so when you see them turn up with the Doctor, you're like, well, who are you and how did you end up and why does the Doctor know you? So yeah, there's some changes that just are a bit too weird for me. I do appreciate and like the regeneration at the end. I like that they've taken it from, you know, an outside source where a regeneration had made and actually gave them credit for it. So I think that's really nice. Yeah, but I also wasn't a huge fan that they replaced the faces that the Doctor sees during his regeneration with the new Who Doctors. I thought, no, you don't need to do that. I know why you did it, you know, for, you know, the new fans watching, but you didn't need to do that. It's a bit weird. It almost makes it seem like those faces are preset in that Doctor now, and it's like you were always going to get those faces. We're just giving you a bit of a one of, do you want to have that face early or not, you know? But yeah, so basically the Doctor, Jamie and Zoe land in this like war zone, and they base in the middle of the war, and they have to try and figure out what's going on, and they discover that there's different time zones in close proximity to each other, like an American Civil War zone, a Roman zone, stuff like that, all intertwined with each other, and they're just killing each other for sport, and they're being watched over by these people higher up, and the Doctor's got to sort of work out what's going on and how this is being done and who's running it, and he ends up calling in the Time Lords for help. And the Time Lords are really menacing in this story, by the way. They are the most menacing they've ever been in the show's history, and they have powers that they never use again, like being able to freeze time, slow down time, you know, zap people out of existence. They can do whatever they like, but they just never use any of that shit again. But yeah, the War Games, good. The first version was a bit too long. The second version that we got in colour, you know, made some characters irrelevant and made some weird lore changes that I don't think really needed to be done. But that is going to be my ranking of every single Second Doctor episode. I hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, please like it by giving it a thumbs up and comment down below your thoughts on the Second Doctor's era. So in the next video will be the last one in this ranking every episode from every Doctor's era. We will go back to the early 1960s and take a look at the first Doctor's era played by the amazing William Hartnell. But for now, this is the Nerdy Grail signing off. I hope you've had an amazing day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now, everyone.